All right, everyone, buckle up because today we are diving into a topic that's, well, it's a bit of a head-scratcher.
Oh, you can say that again?
We're talking about freedom and order. Specifically, how we balance those two things in a democracy.
Yeah, one of those classic dilemmas, right? Like, how much freedom can we have before it all falls apart?
Right. And get this, the study we're looking at today actually suggests that maybe, just maybe, too much freedom without any kind of, guidelines or structure could actually lead to, well, chaos.
You know, it's funny because we always think of freedom as this ultimate good thing, but the study, it's called The Need for a Moral Framework in Democratic Societies. And it makes a pretty strong case for the idea that unlimited freedom can actually be, well, kind of dangerous.
It's kind of like, think about driving. Imagine if there were no traffic laws.
Yeah.
At first you might think, sweet, freedom.
Right, no speed limits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I bet it would get pretty scary pretty fast. I mean, without any rules, who knows what would happen?
Yeah, it'd be total chaos. And you probably wouldn't even be able to get where you're going, which is kind of the whole point the study's trying to make about societies, right? You need some rules, some sort of agreement on how things work, or else it all falls apart.
And that's where this whole idea of the social contract comes in. Like, we agree to give up a little bit of our absolute freedom in exchange for some security and stability. And the study actually dives into the ideas of two pretty famous philosophers who had very different views on this whole social contract thing.
Hobbes and Locke, right.
Yeah. Now, Hobbes, he was a bit of a, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly known for his sunny disposition.
Right. He basically thought humans were, well, kind of selfish and power-hungry by nature. And he said that without rules, things would be, and I quote, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah, not exactly a party animal, that Hobbes. But Locke had a slightly rosier view of human nature. He believed we had this capacity for reason and cooperation,
So Locke was more like, hey, we can create a system where people are free to pursue their own goals, but within a framework that protects everyone's rights.
Yeah. And that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Like the foundation of how we think about democracy today. But here's the thing. The study points out that even democracies, even with all their emphasis on individual freedom, well, they've got some limitations.
Exactly. Like, just because we have elections doesn't mean we're automatically going to end up with the best leaders, right?
Yeah.
The study actually cites research suggesting that the kind of people who are drawn to these positions of power, they're not always motivated by, the public good.
It's like sometimes it's more about getting elected than it is about actually serving the people. And the study highlights a few ways democracies can, well, kind of go off the rails, like money in politics, for example. They specifically mentioned the Citizens United case here in the U.S.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. It basically opened the floodgates for corporations and unions to spend tons of money on political campaigns.
Which, according to the study, can really distort things, like who has the loudest voice? The people with the most money.
Right. And that can lead to a situation where ordinary citizens start to feel like their voices don't even matter. Like, what's the point of voting if the whole system is rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful?
And the study also points to the rise of populism in Europe as another example of how things can go wrong. Like, when people are feeling anxious and uncertain, they can be more susceptible to these charismatic leaders who offer simple solutions to complex problems.
Yeah, and those solutions aren't always, good for everyone in the long run.
So the big question this study poses is, how do we protect democracies from these potential pitfalls?
And their answer? A moral framework. They argue that we need some kind of shared understanding of right and wrong, a set of principles that can guide our decisions and actions.
Okay, so that sounds pretty straightforward, right? But the real question is, what exactly does this moral framework look like?
And that, my friend, is where things get interesting.
To put it mildly. Because the study proposes a specific moral framework, and it's based on three main pillars. And each one is, shall we say, a bit controversial.
Yeah, let's just say they're not exactly going for the easy way out.
Okay, so pillar number one, the nuclear family. They really emphasize the importance of the traditional family structure, mom, dad, and kids.
They argue that this particular family structure is kind of like the bedrock of a stable society. They cite a bunch of research about how kids raised in these families tend to do better in all sorts of ways.
And I know this can be a sensitive topic, but it's important to remember that we're just presenting the study's argument here.
Right, exactly. They're not saying other family structures are bad or anything, but they are making a specific argument about the societal benefits of this traditional model.
Okay, so that's pillar number one. Now brace yourself for pillar number two, clear gender standards.
And this is where things get really interesting. The study basically says, look, Humans are biologically male or female.
And they argue that promoting a spectrum of gender identities can be harmful, especially for kids.
Yeah, this is definitely the most provocative part of their argument, and it's going to spark a lot of debate, for sure.
Okay, so we've got the nuclear family, we've got clear gender standards. What's the third pillar of their moral framework?
The third one is, well, it's the idea that we should use scientific facts as moral guides. They're basically saying that because science tells us certain things about human biology, those things should inform our values as a society.
So they're drawing a pretty direct line between what science tells us and how we should live our lives. And this, of course, leads to a whole bunch of questions about, well, whose interpretation of science are we talking about?
Right, and where does individual freedom fit into all of this?
So, dear listeners, there you have it, the 3 pillars of the moral framework, according to this study. And we know that this is a lot to take in. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's not exactly lighthearted cocktail party chatter, but it's important stuff to think about.
And that's what we're here to do. So what do you think about all of this? What stands out to you about these 3 pillars?
What resonates with you and what raises some red flags? We're going to dig deeper into each of these ideas in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned. You know that third pillar, using science as a moral guide? It's really stuck with me. It's kind of like they're saying, hey, science can tell us what's right and wrong.
Yeah, like science is the ultimate authority.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it's a little unsettling. Like, where does personal belief come into play? What about things like, faith or intuition?
Right. Like, is there no room for those things in their framework? And it makes me wonder, science is always evolving. What happens when our scientific understanding changes? Does our morality change with it?
Whoa, that's a deep thought. I mean, we've seen this happen throughout history. Like, ideas about race and gender, they've changed so much over time as our scientific knowledge has grown. So if we're basing our morality on science, well, doesn't that mean our morality could be constantly shifting too?
Exactly. And that's kind of scary, right? It's like, what if we end up with a society where what's considered moral today is completely immoral tomorrow? It just feels a little too, unstable.
Definitely makes you think. But to be fair to the study, they do bring up some real-world examples to kind of illustrate their point.
Oh, yeah. They talk about the whole debate over gender identity in schools, right? Like, should kids be learning about a gender spectrum, or should we stick to a more traditional binary view of gender?
Yeah. And they seem to side with those who say, hey, let's stick to what biology tells us. Boys are boys, girls are girls. It's a very clear-cut, black and white kind of perspective.
Right. And they argue that introducing all this complexity about gender at a young age, it just creates confusion and it undermines these traditional values that they believe are so important for a stable society.
But I can see the other side of it too. Don't kids deserve to have all the information? And shouldn't we encourage them to question things and figure out who they are, even if it challenges traditional norms?
Absolutely. And I think that's where the real dilemma lies. How do we balance respecting individual freedom with maintaining these societal norms that, supposedly provide order and stability? It's a tough one, that's for sure.
The study also talks about the influence of money in U.S. politics.
Oh, yeah. They see that as a major problem.
They argue that the whole system of campaign financing, it's gotten way out of hand. Politicians are so busy trying to raise money that they don't have time to, actually govern. And they're more worried about pleasing their donors than they are about serving the people.
Right. It's like the whole pursuit of winning, it's become more important than the pursuit of, the common good.
They see this as a sign of a society that's lost its moral compass.
Like, we've become so focused on individual gain that we've forgotten about the importance of, working together for the benefit of all. And they draw some interesting parallels to what's happening in Europe with the rise of populism.
Oh, yeah. They talk about how populist leaders, they often appeal to people's fears and anxieties.
Right. And they offer these simple solutions to really complex problems. But those solutions, they often come at the expense of, minority groups or democratic norms.
So in their view, populism is kind of like a symptom of a society that's, kind of falling apart. Like, we've lost our sense of unity, our shared values.
And they believe that their moral framework, with its emphasis on traditional families, clear gender roles and all that, they believe that's the answer. That's what will bring us back together.
But is it really that simple? Can we really just impose this one-size-fits-all moral framework on such a diverse and complex society?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, the study makes some thought-provoking points, but it also raises a lot of concerns, especially when it comes to, individual freedom and the potential for discrimination.
So, dear listeners, We've delved into the source's argument, explored its complexities, and even highlighted some potential concerns. Now, we want to hear from you.
What resonates with you? What parts of the source's argument do you find compelling, and what parts raise questions or concerns for you?
Do you believe that a strong moral framework is essential for a functioning society? And if so, what principles should guide that framework? How do we balance individual freedom with the need for shared values? It's really amazing how this study connects these big ideas like freedom and order to everyday stuff, like what our kids are learning in school.
It really shows you how these philosophical debates, they're not just happening in some ivory tower. They have real-world implications.
Absolutely. And this whole idea that we need some kind of moral compass to guide us, well, it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, because without some kind of shared values, it's like, where do we draw the line? Like, how much freedom is too much?
Right. Like, freedom is great, but it can't be absolute, right? There have to be some limits, some sense of what's right and wrong.
And the study really emphasizes the role of traditional institutions in setting those limits. Like, they see the nuclear family and these clear-cut gender roles as being essential for a stable society.
Yeah, and that's where I get a little bit hesitant. I mean, those traditional structures, they don't work for everyone, right? What about people who don't fit neatly into those boxes?
Right. Like, we live in a world that's so much more diverse than, maybe what the study is envisioning. And I think it's important to be mindful of that. Like, how do we create a moral framework that's inclusive and respectful of everyone's differences?
Exactly. And it's not just about diversity, it's about change, too.
Yeah.
I mean, society is constantly evolving. What might have been considered moral 50 years ago might not be seen the same way today.
Totally. And it makes you wonder, how do we create a moral framework that can adapt to those changes?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the study really provides a satisfactory answer.
Yeah, I mean, they make some interesting points, but it's like they're presenting this very specific, very traditional view of morality, and it just doesn't feel like it captures the full complexity of, how we live our lives today.
I agree. But even though I might not agree with everything in the study, I do think it raises some really important questions, like how do we balance individual freedom with a need for order? How do we create a society where everyone feels safe and respected, but also free to be themselves?
Yeah, those are big questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers, but they're definitely worth wrestling with.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty controversial study, I'm wondering, what are your biggest takeaways?
Well, for me, it's the reminder that these big philosophical debates, they're not just academic exercises. They really do have an impact on our lives. And I think it's up to all of us to engage in these conversations and try to figure out, what kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. And for you, dear listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. Maybe it's even sparked some lively debates around your own dinner table. What does freedom mean to you? How much order do we really need? And what kind of moral framework, if any, do you think we need to guide us in the 21st century? These are tough questions, but they're worth asking. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.